During the late 1890s and through the first years of the new century, Penetanguishene was the center of the lumbering boom in Simcoe County and a prosperous town. By 1907, it had 6 sawmills, 2 box factories, a couple of planing mills, sash and door factories, a pail and tub factory, and other related industries. The docks were busy with incoming rafts of logs, and many townspeople went into the bush in the winter to work in the lumber camps. The 4 major lumber mills in operation of the time were the Firstbrook Company, Beck Manufacturing Company, McGibbon's, and Gropp Brothers. The Firstbrook Box Company was one of the first industries in the Georgian Bay region, opening its doors for business in 1867. The company, which was Toronto-based, was owned by 2 brothers, John and W.A. Firstbrook. By the end of the century, its Penetanguishene operation sprawled over 70 waterfront acres and was served by a spur line of the Grand Trunk Railway. The plant was capable of turning out some 100,000 feet of custom-sawn lumber per day, and its box-making section used some 700,000 feet of timber every month. Firstbrook had a payroll of between 250 to 300 people, making it a major employer in Penetanguishene. The Gropp Brothers' Penetanguishene lumber and shingles mills came into being in 1900 and occupied some 10 acres between the waterfront and the railway. They had a capacity of about 25,000 feet of lumber a day, and they supplied both rough and dressed lumber, shingles, lath, and many other wood products required by the building trades in Toronto and other major cities. The McGibbon Lumber Company was established back in 1855 and was originally owned by D.J. Mitchell, then David Davidson, who then sold it to Finley McGibbon. By the turn of the century, it was operated by Finley's son, Charles, while the family's other mills at Sarnia, Ontario, were directed by Finley Jr. and John. The Penetanguishene plant employed about 60 mill hands and shipped millions of feet of lumber yearly to the northern United States. Lumber was shipped primarily via the North Simcoe Railway, which had extended its track to Penetanguishene in 1879, aided by financing from the town's industrialists. The largest of the Penetanguishene mill operations, the Beck Manufacturing Company, went into production in 1878 and was incorporated under the laws of the province of Ontario 2 years later, with a capital of $250,000. The company had 2 of the best-equipped sawmills in Ontario, with a combined capacity of some 175,000 feet per day, and a lath mill which produced a record 128,000 pieces in a single day in 1910. Its saw and planing mills, warehouses, dry sheds, yards, and offices stretched for almost a mile along the town's waterfront and provided employment for almost 250 men. All of these firms owned or leased the timber rights on huge tracts of forest along the eastern and northern shores of Georgian Bay, the North Channel, and west to Michipicoten, and beyond on Lake Superior. Each year, the cutting ground was more remote as stand after stand of accessible timber was stripped clean. Countless thousands of logs were floated down Georgian Bay in great rafts, fenced in by booms behind tugs and other towing vessels. Of all the tugs that hauled logs into Penetanguishene, the most famous was the Wanapitei, as it was a hometown product in all respects, an object of local pride. The Wanapitei was built in the winter of 1904 and 05 by the Beck Company at their waterfront yards, the oak timbers for her keel and ribs having been sawn at the Gropp Brothers' new mill in Penetanguishene. The board was sailed under an all-Penetanguishene crew, which included a captain, his mate, 2 engineers, 2 firemen, 2 wheelsmen, and a cook. For almost a quarter of a century, the Wanapitei was engaged in coaxing huge rafts of logs across the bay from such points as the French River, Little Current, and Thistleon. Often, The booms enclosed as many as 180,000 logs, enough to keep the company mills in operation for a month or more. The peak periods of lumbering in Penetanguishene occurred between 1900 and 1905, when over 350 square miles of land were under license. In the early years of lumbering, lumbermen would have been hired locally in Penetanguishene to work in the camps from fall until spring, and in the mill over the summer. In later years, many men were hired through agencies, particularly from Montreal and Toronto. Life in a lumber camp was rugged and difficult. The typical logging camp consisted of one or more cabins, usually called caboose shanties, made of logs trimmed on the spot. Each shanty housed about 100 men, with 2 tiers of rough-cut limber bunks along 3 sides. Heating and cooking facilities were provided by a huge fire pit in the center of the building, where a roaring log fire blazed continuously from late September to April. Light and ventilation came through a 6-foot hole in the roof over the fire pit. The food was made mainly from barreled staples such as beans, salt pork, flour, and blackstrap molasses, and was occasionally supplemented by potatoes, turnips, and other root raised on lumber camp depot farms. There was usually plenty of baked bread and pies, but the diet was very monotonous and lacking in fresh ingredients to ward off diseases. Once the men had gone into camp in mid-September, the cutting of the timber began. As the logs were pulled out of the bush, each log was branded with a marking hammer, a horseshoe-shaped mark identified from the Beck company, making the log easy to identify on the remainder of its trip to the mill. Companies were liable for a $50 fine for failing to select and use identifying mark on timber when lumbering. Lumberjacks felled tree in the cold months, and once cut, they transported them to the site of the Spring River Drive via skid roads. These were paths created in the snow from the bush to the water's edge. To ease travel for the sledges, the men iced the roads by pouring water on roads and allowed them to freeze. The logs were either left at the water's edge or on the ice until it melted. Once the ice disappeared, preparations for the spring drive were conducted by Sortie Crew. The crew consisted of about 30 men and worked 12 hours a day from April until October, directing the logs through the narrow part of the river into the correct pocket. Logs were then gathered into the lake booms, which in turn were delivered to a waiting tug. During the hot months, the rest of the crew would work in the lumber mills, processing millions of tons of logs cut in the previous season. This yearly cycle of lumbering in the area created massive deforestation and scarcity of trees after 100 years of uncontrolled cutting by mill owners. By the 1930s, many of the lumber companies in the area had closed down or downsized, and by the 1960s, there were none in existence. Although the major lumber mills' presence in the community was short-lived, their contribution to the development of the town was instrumental. The Firstbrook homestead was turned into Penetanguishene's first hospital in 1912. Charles McGibbon became warden of Simcoe County in 1889, mayor from 1905 to 07, and his dedication to education assisted the town in acquiring a new high school. And lastly, the C. Beck Manufacturing Company's general store and lumber office was donated to the town of Penetanguishene to house the town's museum, an everlasting symbol of when lumber was king.